Attention, brave souls. What you're about to witness might make your heart race. Before the suspense takes over your screen, click subscribe now and hit the like button. Get ready for a spine-chilling experience. But be warned, only the boldest will survive until the end.
My name is Aaron Smith, and I was a park ranger stationed in one of the most remote and unforgiving places on Earth, gates of the Arctic National Park, Alaska. In 2001, I was 32 years old, and while I wasn't one to believe in tall tales or ghost stories, something happened to me out there that I've never been able to explain. I tried to bury the memory, but it clings to me like the frostbite scars I brought back from that desolate wilderness. I don't share this lightly. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story for entertainment. It's a warning. The Arctic doesn't forgive carelessness. It's a place that demands respect, where even the smallest mistake can mean your life. I understood that, and I was good at my job. When they sent me out on a solo mission to monitor wildlife near the southern edge of the park, I didn't think twice. It was late September, and the chill in the air carried the promise of the brutal winter to come. Before I left, an elder from the Bettles community pulled me aside. She was short and wiry, her face weathered by years of Arctic wind. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength and said, "Be careful, Ranger. Don't wander where the keelet walks." I forced a smile, chalking it up to local superstition. "I'll be fine," I said, trying to reassure her. Her grip tightened. "It doesn't leave tracks, but it's always behind you. You'll know it when it's too late." Her words lingered in my mind as I set off, even as I told myself it was just folklore, a way to explain the disappearances and strange occurrences that were bound to happen in a place as wild and isolated as this. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked through the tundra, the sun low in the sky despite the early hour. The landscape stretched endlessly, a mixture of barren mountains and icy rivers, with no signs of human life for miles. The air was so cold and crisp it felt like breathing glass. I set up camp that evening, proud of my progress, and made a small fire to keep the darkness at bay. That night, the stillness was absolute. No wind, no rustling of trees. There were none here. Just the crackle of my fire and the occasional distant howl. Mules, I thought. But something about those howls made my skin crawl. They didn't sound quite right. Too elongated, too hollow, as if the wind itself were mourning. The next morning, I found tracks near my camp. They were large, too large for any wolf or bear I'd seen. The strangest part? They didn't lead to or from anywhere. Just a cluster of them in the snow, like something had stood there watching. I radioed back to the base to report the tracks. "Might be a bear," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Keep your eyes open," came the reply, crackling with static. "And keep us updated." I packed up and moved on, the unease settling in my chest like ice water. The further I went, the more I noticed signs of something strange. Animals were scarce, even in areas where I'd expected to see caribou or ptarmigans. The howls returned that night, closer this time. I sat by my fire, clutching my rifle, every nerve on edge. I didn't sleep. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the distance, a shadow slipping between the rocks. When I shone my flashlight, there was nothing there. By the third day, I was questioning everything I knew. Rational explanations became harder to cling to. The tracks appeared again, this time alongside a creek. They weren't just large, they were deep, pressed into the frozen earth with a weight no animal should carry. I followed them for a while, against my better judgment, until they vanished mid-step. That night, the howls became a chorus, echoing off the mountains and surrounding me on all sides. I stayed awake, gripping my rifle until my fingers ached. The fire did little to push back the overwhelming darkness, and I began to feel watched. I'll never forget the moment I saw the shadow. It was barely more than a flicker at the edge of my vision, but it moved against the firelight, fast, silent, and wrong. I froze, my breath fogging in the air, heart pounding in my chest. That's when I remembered the elder's warning. It doesn't leave tracks, but it's always behind you. I didn't know what to believe, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't alone. The Arctic silence is a peculiar thing. It isn't just the absence of sound. It's the way the world holds its breath, leaving you alone with the soft crunch of your boots in the snow and the faint rhythm of your own heartbeat. That silence was my only companion as I ventured further into the gates of the Arctic, the golden light of the setting sun casting long, skeletal shadows across the endless tundra. The tracks I'd been following were unlike anything I'd seen in my years as a ranger. Too large to be a wolf's, too erratic for a bear. Whatever left and didn't move naturally. Its stride was uneven, the impression sometimes shallow, sometimes deep, as if it floated just above the ground. I paused, staring at the prints disappearing into the horizon, a gnawing doubt beginning to take root. But doubt wasn't useful out here. Focus was. I adjusted my pack, exhaling a cloud of breath into the frigid air, and pressed on. The sun dipped lower, and with it came a cold that bit deeper than before, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Then it started. A sound, faint at first, like the distant wail of the wind. But it wasn't the wind. No, this sound was deliberate. It rose and fell in an unnatural cadence, a mournful howl that seemed to echo not just across the landscape but inside my chest, rattling something primal in me. My hand instinctively went to my radio. "This is Smith," I said, my voice steady but low. "I'm hearing something out here. Possibly wolves." "Over." Static. I adjusted the dial, repeated my call. Nothing but static and the low, guttural hum of dead air. I let out a shaky breath, trying to push down the unease creeping up my spine. Nerves. That's all it was. The Arctic was their domain, and I was an intruder. They keep their distance. That's what I told myself. Night fell faster than I anticipated, the Arctic swallowing the light with an unsettling eagerness. I pitched camp near a cluster of boulders, hoping they'd provide some semblance of shelter from the wind. The howls came again, closer this time. They circled me, though I couldn't see a thing beyond the beam of my flashlight. The shadows it cast seemed to dance unnaturally, flickering and bending in ways that defied the light's reach. It was then that I saw them, the tracks. Fresh ones, and possibly close to my camp. My heart hammered as I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam trembling in my unsteady grip. Nothing. Just the tracks leading directly toward my tent, and stopping. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning brought no solace. The tracks were gone, wiped clean as though the snow had healed itself overnight. My rational mind grasped for answers. Wind, drifting snow, some natural phenomenon I wasn't familiar with. But the unease lingered. It wasn't just the tracks. It was the feeling. That oppressive weight in the air, as if the wilderness itself was watching, waiting. By midday, I'd reached a narrow valley, its jagged cliffs casting deep shadows across the snow. The wind died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. I was about to cross when I saw it, a shadow darting along the ridge. My breath caught in my throat. It was fast, and possibly fast, and moved with a strange fluidity, like smoke caught in a draft. I called out instinctively, my voice echoing off the cliffs. "Pali, is someone there?" No response. The shadow paused, just for a moment, and I caught a glimpse of it. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. A creature, dog-like in shape, but wrong in every way. Its body was too long, its legs too spindly, and its eyes, God, its eyes. They glowed with a cold, unnatural light, staring at me with an intelligence that didn't belong to any animal I knew. I raised my flared gun, my hands trembling. "Stand back!" I shouted, though the words felt feeble against the Arctic vastness. The creature didn't move. It just stared, unblinking, as if it were studying me, deciding something. And then, without a sound, it was gone. Not gone in the sense of running away. It simply wasn't there anymore, as if the shadows had swallowed it whole. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where would I go? The vastness of the park offered no sanctuary. I was alone, miles from help, with only the howls and shadows to keep me company. Night fell again, and I knew it would return. Whatever it wasn't done with me. It wasn't hunting in the traditional sense. No, this thing was playing a game, one I didn't understand but was terrified to lose. As I huddled in my tent, gripping my flared gun like it was my lifeline, I could feel it out there, just beyond the thin walls of nylon. Watching, waiting. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood fear. I don't know how I made it to the cabin. My legs moved out of instinct, dragging me through the frozen, unforgiving wilderness as the night closed it around me. The Arctic had always been silent, but this was a different kind of silence, one that pressed against my chest and filled my ears with a soundless scream. The keelet was behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know. Its presence was like a weight on my back, pulling at my resolve to keep moving. When I saw the cabin, it felt like a mirage, a jagged silhouette against the faint glow of a snow-choked moon. My mind screamed that it was a trap, but my body had already decided I needed shelter, even if it was my tomb. The door creaked open, the sound splitting the heavy silence like a gunshot. I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut and throwing my weight against it. My breathing was ragged, clouds of vapor bursting from my mouth in quick, panicked gasps. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room. A single, barren space with walls of aged, splintered wood. The air smelled of mildew and frost. There was no furniture, no sign that anyone had been here in decades. Just me and it. I locked the door with a rusted latch and pushed an old wooden beam into place. Not that it mattered. Whatever was out there didn't need a door to get in. The walls were covered in carvings, crude and desperate. At first, they seemed random. Lines and shapes scratched into the wood with shaking hands. But as I looked closer, the patterns became clear. Figures, twisted and angular, crouching and running. Always running. And there it was, etched over and over again, the keelet. A shadowy dog-like figure with impossibly long limbs, and eyes that seemed to burn right through the wood. My flashlight flickered again, the carvings dancing in and out of focus. I felt them staring at me, watching. A low growl vibrated through the walls, soft at first, almost a suggestion of sound. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to move, to fight, to do something, but I couldn't. It was circling the cabin. I could hear its footsteps now, impossibly light, almost dainty, as they crunched the snow outside. I pressed my ear to the wall, my breath shallow and trembling. The footsteps stopped. Then, a sound I'll never forget, claws, dragging down the wood, slow and deliberate, as if it wanted me to know it was there. My flashlight sputtered, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flare gun, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, heavier than ever, suffocating. It was inside. I didn't hear the door open. I didn't feel the cold rush of air. But I knew. The room was darker now, darker than it should have been. The shadows stretched unnaturally, pulling into corners where the light from my flares couldn't reach. My fingers fumbled over the trigger of the gun, sweat freezing on my palms. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw them, two glowing orbs, hovering in the blackness. Eyes, burning, hateful, and alive. It moved without sound, a blur of darkness that seemed to fold into itself, and then it was gone. But the feeling lingered, that crushing sense of being watched. The carvings on the walls seemed to twist and writhe, as if mocking my terror. I fired the flare, the crimson light illuminating the room in a burst of red. The carvings glowed, their shapes grotesque and shifting, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner, clutching the flare gun with trembling hands, waiting for dawn. The hours stretched into an eternity, each second punctuated by the soft whisper of wind and the phantom echoes of claws on wood. The glowing eyes never returned, but I could feel them. Outside, inside, everywhere. When the first rays of sunlight pierced the frost-covered windows, I bolted from the cabin, my legs weak but filled with a raw, animal instinct to flee. I stumbled through the snow, my mind a haze of exhaustion and fear. When I saw the search team, it was as if I crossed some invisible line back into reality. They found me rambling, delirious, clutching the flared gun like a lifeline. I didn't tell them everything. How could I? They wouldn't believe me. Hell, I didn't believe me. But as I sat by the fire back at Bettles, wrapped in a blanket and staring into the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Keelet was still out there, watching, waiting. The elder's words echoed in my mind. It doesn't need tracks to follow you. And maybe it had. Maybe it always would. The Arctic is vast, wild, and unforgiving. But it isn't empty. No, there's something out there. Something that defies logic and reason. Something that waits in the shadows for those who dare to venture too far. And as the wind howled outside the window that night, I realized I'd brought something back with me. A silence, a shadow, and a truth I'll never be able to outrun.